lots of reasons why I love my job. Overarching, it's because I love seeing the difference that good nutrition makes. And I love seeing this in clinical trials. I love seeing it proven in statistics, but more than anything, I love seeing it in the growth that we see in the children that we look after in the weeks and months and years. And because of my job, I understand the importance of good nutrition in infancy and childhood for both short and long-term health. And perhaps this is more important to recognize in PWS, where there are more challenges that get in the way of the achievement of that good growth and good nutrition. So today, what I want to do is to show you why it should be a priority for us to maximize the benefits of good nutrition and growth in PWS, and why it's important to minimize the risks that may be associated with poor nutrition or poor suboptimal growth. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you 4 key messages. The first key message is about the importance of tracking and monitoring growth in our patients, because this is the insight that shows us whether our dietary management is being successful. The second key message I've got for you is that we need to consider not just the quantity of food or the quantity of the diet, but the quality of that diet as well. It's not just what it is, but where it's from and all the quality associated. Both of these make a difference. Both of these are important. The third key message is that we need to consider calories beyond those on the plate of the children that we look after. I want to propose to you that we need to think about calories in terms of access and expenditure of calories just as much as we think about the calories that our patients and children eat. And lastly, we need a consistent approach to dietary management in PWS, but within this consistency, having some flexibility to the different challenges that may occur at the different timeframes. So these are my 4 key messages. And what I'm going to do is to take each one of these messages and I'm going to share with you the most recent clinical data that underpins these messages. And I'm also going to share with you some of my own experiences. I've been part of a PWS clinic for the last nearly 15 years here. So I'm going to be sharing with you some of that as well. So the first key message I've got for you is about the importance of tracking and monitoring growth. Now, one of the things we understand about the journey of our PWS children is that it is characterized by several factors that are different to children who don't have PWS. So we see slow infant growth, often requiring nutritional support. We see an increased risk of early childhood obesity. We see an absence of the pubertal growth spurt, and we see adolescent short stature. And each of these is important to recognize when we're tracking growth that it is inherent to PWS. So the tracking of growth is important, and how frequently we do this is also just as important. Now, several groups have proposed how frequently we should assess the anthropometrics or the weight and height of our patients. This group from the US, the Committee on Genetics, proposed this suggestion here. And I would certainly agree that there's an increased need frequency of measurements in the period of infancy, where it's particularly important to ensure adequate nutrition to support short and long-term health. And that you may be able to reduce your frequency of measurements as the child gets older. However, what I would say is that we need possibly a more flexible approach, because, for example, measuring our PWS patients annually in this age group is perhaps not frequently enough. And the principle behind that is because it needs to be individual and it needs to be reactive. So by this, I mean that if we're seeing our families, our PWS children who are have an accelerated rate of growth, obviously there's an increased requirement for a more frequent measurements to track that growth pattern. And we may feel comfortable measuring and monitoring our PWS children's growth less often if their growth appears to be more stable. But the purpose of regular monitoring in this group is really so that we can identify early changes in growth velocity, so that when we start to see weight accelerate, we can change the dietary management that we're doing or make alterations to gain it under control. We also need to consider that when we're looking at growth patterns, that body composition, we understand, is different in PWS children. And work from the 1990s in Switzerland was one of the first to identify that not only do we see a higher fat percentage in overweight PWS children, but actually we see a higher fat represented in infants with undernutrition, suggesting that before obesity has even begun, we see a disproportion body composition. So body composition is important because it influences the weight that we see when we do measurements. And so you can see, if you look, for example, at a BMI chart based on PWS children, with the non-PWS children shown in the shaded grey area and the centiles marked for PWS children, that there is a much greater range for BMI. And this is partly due to the growth pattern and partly related also to the body composition. So this is what we understand about this. What can we do? Well, the first thing we can do is to ensure that we frequently monitor infants' growth, and that we do this using WHO growth charts, no matter where we are. The 2006 WHO growth reference study shown here provided the data for the blueprints that we now use for growth charts for all infants. And so plotting our PWS infants on the WHO charts up until the age of 2 is appropriate. And from this point, then using country-specific population growth charts is most appropriate due to the differences that we know that are inherent between different growth patterns, between different continents and even countries. We may also want to consider the use of PWS growth charts. Now, currently, there have been 5 countries that have produced PWS-specific growth charts. So the US, Germany, Thailand, Korea. And these may want to be considered. And the reason that they're useful is that you can see, for example, if you look at the US, the ones produced by Butler and colleagues, as you can see the differences in the expected rates of growth, both in terms of weight and height. Now, I'm not advocating the use of growth charts because these can be considered relatively controversial, and certainly we would consider that they may be reflective only of the population from which the data has been collected. But they are something we can consider. Something we can do, no matter what charts you're using, is ensure that the measurements that we take for our children are both accurate and taken appropriately. Now, it's very important we actually take measurements ourselves. We know from good quality data and systematic reviews that parents' perception of their child's weight or growth pattern is not always reliable. So taking objective measurements ourselves is really important. And just as we see parents' perception of their own child's weight may be slightly skewed, we actually see data to suggest that health professionals like dietitians like myself, or even endocrinologists or medical health professionals or nurses, actually none of us are always reliable at just looking at a child and making a visual assessment of their nutritional status. So taking accurate measurements, plotting them accurately on the correct growth charts to track growth and therefore guide your dietary management is really important. So the second key message I've got for you is around the quality and the quantity of the diet. Now, the first thing we know, we understand about PWS children and calories is that the requirement is lower. A recent systematic review suggested that total energy expenditure, activity energy expenditure, sleep energy expenditure are all significantly lower in PWS children compared to age, sex, and BMI matched controls. Now, how much lower is a little controversial, and it's also individual. But there is general agreement within much of the PWS community that calorie requirements may be around 60% of a non-PWS child. And one way is to use height. It can also be proposed as a way to determine the calorie requirements for a child. But we have to remember that these requirements, although we know they are lower, they are individual, and therefore the gold standard would be measurements with indirect calorimetry. But of course, the availability of this in clinical practice is often quite limited. So whilst we understand that caloric requirements are much lower in this group, what's not lower is micronutrients. In fact, the micronutrient requirements of PWS children is just the same as any other child. And I think what we've begun to understand more in the last 2 decades is the role that many micronutrients play in the optimal development, both physical and cognitive, in micronutrients in infants, both in terms of short and long term. So for example, iron deficiency anemia, we know, has an influence on linear growth in infancy, in childhood, and even in adolescence, and has a cause and effect relationship with cognitive function too. So micronutrients are not lower in PWS children, and they are just as important as any other child to maximize potential. We also understand that there may be some of these micronutrients that may be at greater risk of running lower in low-calorie diets used for PWS children. Now, to date, only 3 studies have looked at micronutrient intakes in PWS cohorts, one from America, one from Canada, and one from Northern Europe. And there are some micronutrients that consistently have been shown to run low in this population. Vitamin D and calcium are 2 of them, with other micronutrients like iron, zinc, selenium, and fiber being shown to be low in just 1 or 2 of the studies. But I think we have to be careful about extrapolating data from one population's dietary intake to another, because of course we see huge differences in dietary practice and dietary intakes between countries. But certainly it would be it's useful to look at your own country's individual intakes of micronutrients, those which are high risk in different age groups, and more broadly to consider consequences like osteoporosis, which we know is greater in our PWS children, and therefore highlights the importance of certain nutrients like calcium and vitamin D in this particular group, relevant more broadly to the condition. So what can we do based on what we know? Well, we can provide families with broad ideas of calorie requirements for their children. Now, this is just a guide only, and this is a very crude 60% of the recommended intake based on UK data. And I certainly wouldn't use this in clinical practice to tell a family that their child requires 990 calories, or to be specific as enough to 834. But I would use this to give the parents some context of the calorie requirement, maybe say around 1,000 calories or around 1,200 calories. Because it's very important that our families have some appreciation of what that calorie requirement is. And at the same time, what we can do is to educate our families on what that calorie requirement looks like. And there are many ways in which we can do this that have been found to be very helpful. Using visual displays of portion sizes is a very practical and very clear way of sharing with families what we expect the children to eat. Likewise, teaching our families how to read nutrition labels so they can understand the caloric contribution to the child's diet is really a very important lesson. And the use, for example, of portion cups, such as you see here, that ensure a consistent dietary intake of, for example, portions of rice, portions of pasta, allow the consistency and achievement of that set caloric requirement. The other thing we can do is to use a multivitamin and mineral to ensure that the low caloric intake that we provide our children doesn't come at a cost of a low micronutrient intake. So this is certainly suggested, and I would say the concentration is around the mineral content, not the vitamin content. That's where the need is around the minerals. We also can take biochemical markers in our clinics to look at micronutrient intakes. However, this practice is varied. However, I would guide you to this position paper from the European Society last year that reminds us that if you look at a micronutrient intake from a biochemical sample, it will be altered by the inflammatory response. So if the child has a raised CRP or has an acute illness, that micronutrient intake, micronutrient measurement may be altered. So really, if we do look at micronutrients, we need to do this in combination, not just with the biochemical marker, but with a clinical examination looking for physical signs, and in combination with a dietary history to look at dietary intakes of those micronutrients. And combined, that will allow us a multimodal approach to assess the micronutrient status. So the third key message I've got for you is about thinking about calories beyond just food. And I think when we think about this, we think about not just what's on the plate, but the access to those calories and the expenditures of those calories. So if we look at access to calories, I commonly use this diagram for our families to highlight that food security, the access to calories, is at the base, it's the foundation. Because no matter what your dietary strategy might be, no matter the food choices that you make for your child or the supplements you may choose to put them on, if the child has access to food outside what is being delivered, this will lead to unsuccessful management. So food security is very important, and this can take different forms, from very simple, physical, tangible interventions like locks on cupboards or on doors, to more three-dimensional, principle-based approaches like the no hope, no doubt, no disappointment approach from Linda Gurash and colleagues. Now, I understand that you've had this talked about in the ECHO meetings before, so I won't go into detail, but the access and the consideration is important. And the expenditure too is important for us to consider, because we understand that our PWS children may find exercise and activity harder and less enjoyable. And certainly some work from a systematic review published just very recently has suggested why this might be. So we need to consider some of these too. For example, the impaired hormonal response after exercise will mean that there is less enjoyment as a result of that activity. So based on what we understand, what can we do? The first thing we can do is surrounding access is to provide context for families, for schools, for all environments that our PWS children are in, for people to consider all the aspects around the control of calories. And Linda Guresh's work in the production of a checklist, which is available online, is really very useful, not necessarily to be used every single day, but to provide the understanding for all of those involved, just how careful we need to be with the access. In terms of expenditure, embedding exercise into the daily life of our PWS children is really important from an early age. Hidden exercise in terms of getting off the bus one stop sooner, using the car less, more walking is really important. And we see great success with some of our families who have done this right from the beginning. I also think it's important that we educate ourselves and our families on what the caloric expenditure is of activity in PWS children. And this work from the Australian group that can be downloaded from this website is very, very useful. For example, you can use this data to show that a 35 kilogram child who cycles for 15 minutes is going to burn around 40 calories. And that's very useful for our families to understand when it comes to considering snacks that might come following activity to ensure the balance remains outside of the surplus. The other thing we can do is to look at how we can make activity more successful. And this group from Australia very nicely have highlighted 3 practical ways to make exercise more successful, which is involving the PWS patient, involving them in the decision of what activity they do, ensuring clear communication between the person running the exercise or the activity, and ensuring there's a willingness for that person doing the activity with the PWS person to adapt and to be flexible around what the patient would like. And then lastly, we need to be flexible through the ages. And we see work from Jennifer Miller, who's highlighted for us that the historical view of 2 distinct nutrition phases in PWS, the first of undernutrition and poor growth, and the second of excess nutrition and excess growth, is actually much more subtle. And there may be 5 different stages of nutrition phases that go through the lifespan. But it's also important not just to consider these 5 stages, but to consider it within the entire context of the development of our PWS person. Now, this group from the US developed some very helpful guidelines. Now, they proposed the use of an MDT team that includes all of these individuals. Now, we may have access to none of these individuals, some or all of these individuals. But the key principle is that when this group developed a checklist of the different stages to consider for the child, they were involving consideration from all these specialities. So what you get is a very holistic checklist through the ages, and considering each of those in the context of diet can be very useful. And then lastly, I would say that within the different phases, adolescence is increasingly recognized as a period of increased challenges in our patients, particularly as a result of three things: increased prevalence of hyperphagia, increased autonomy associated with adolescence, and a decrease in physical activity. All of these making this period the highest risk, suggesting that this is the period where we need the tightest control on dietary management and where we need perhaps the most monitoring. However, what I would say is that this, despite being one of the most difficult timeframes, is one of the timeframes when we've seen in our clinic some of our PWS children absolutely shine and do better in adolescence than was ever expected, and have shown periods of fantastic weight loss and fantastic episodes of becoming more autonomous and actually controlling their weight too. So we recognize that it's a difficult phase, but it's also a phase when we see some great achievements and great progress. So to recap, my 4 key messages for you today was about the importance of tracking and monitoring growth, because this is how we determine whether our dietary management is being successful and determines whether or not we need to make changes in the frequency that we observe growth. We must consider not just the quantity of the food in the diet, but the quality of that food, focusing on the micronutrients that will optimize and manage growth well. We need to think about calories, not just on what's in front of our children, but actually how they have access to those calories and how they expend them. And lastly, about being flexible through the ages, paying particular attention